right, so here's the thing. I do not have a watch list. Rather, I have a playlist, okay, to suggest to you. So my husband is in the funeral business, okay, and lately I've noticed we're hearing more and more conversations about death and dying. You know, it's kind of a conversation you don't want to have. I don't know if you've heard us talk on here about death cafes before, where people gather to talk about the subject. And again, nobody really likes to talk about that one.
A necessity, but the people don't like it.
But more and more people, I think, are opening up to the idea of talking about what do you want when the time comes? What do we do? How do we handle it? Well, a couple of guys who also work in the funeral industry realized a few years ago that there wasn't really anything out there in terms of a podcast, okay? So the Undertakers started something called Undertaking, the podcast, all right? 300 plus episodes later, it has turned out to be a really interesting listen for just about anybody. Here is what the two told me when I ran into them recently at a conference in Nashville.
I mean, we're learning a lot. We just talked to a gentleman that's from Egypt and how they do burial and things over there. So funeral service is much different over there. It consists of 4 hours. So it's completely different than here in the States.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What are some of the topics that have literally blown your mind? Are there 2 or 3 that you covered that you just sort of went, wow, I had no idea?
I would say a big episode for me where I learned an immense amount was when we had the chance to talk to a gentleman from the Body Farm. Jake Smith, absolutely amazing. He talked about the forensic aspect of a body decomposing and whatever else. And honestly, I don't think the public sees that quite as much. So we had the opportunity to bring that story to them. He was very intimately involved, I think, for about 7 years there. So very cool. That was a big episode for me because it was just interesting, especially with crime scene investigation. It's absolutely interesting.
You know, we've got some core beliefs that people matter, living or dead, and we need to be able to take some time and breathe and to mark those milestones. Death is the last milestone in the life of a person, but it's a change in the life of a family. And since we were infants, we were taught to say hello and goodbye, and when folks don't get that goodbye, it's sad. It's really sad. So we want to use this show to empower families to make decisions that benefit their family, whether it's a traditional service or they're making a new tradition within their family, or it's a religious ceremony.
Well, I think the nuances in funeral service too, natural organic reduction and the different things that come into play here. For us, I like to highlight things like that because it's change. It's something different. It's something new within funeral service. Instead of be afraid of it, why can't we, not necessarily, I wouldn't say necessarily accept it, but let's learn about it and maybe understand it a little bit more before we start judging certain things. Everybody has a different way of doing things, and we got to accept that.
Ryan Ballard and Brian Waters of Undertaking the podcast. Thanks, you guys. Interesting, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
You know, it really is. And they mentioned the Body Farm, which is a real research facility in Tennessee. And these are the kind of people that they have on there. And it's interesting to me because people the world over deal with death and dying in very, very many different ways. You've got green burials, you've got all sorts of different, sort of traditions that people do, and you can learn a lot because these guys have reached out and talked to people about all sorts of things. You've got things like a lot of history, Civil War embalming, Viking funerals, dealing with grief, things like body donation. There's one called Remembering Gettysburg. Interesting stuff. Organ and tissue donation, things like how COVID affect the funeral industry, helping children deal with grief. Really interesting topics,
Bizarre.
And those two just started it in their spare time. They both work in the industry and they both do this on the side, but they were set up at this conference and they were interviewing people left and right, and they were posting that day, and I'm sure there's probably content they haven't even gotten around to posting yet. But they do it full-time, not full-time, they have full-time jobs, but they keep it going. They have fresh episodes all the time.
That's
interesting.
Great. It is. Very much so.
Yeah. You can find Undertaking the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I love a good podcast.
Yeah,
listen to them all the time. Yeah.
All right. There you are.
Yeah.
Give it a listen.
That's my suggestion.
All right. Coming up, it is one of the most important